Hello and welcome back to El Partido, the yet another Spanish football podcast. But as always, we've got that little hint of nostalgia, haven't we, Paul? We are always looking backwards. It's not necessarily a bad thing, is it?
No. There's an art to it, I think, isn't there? Which we're trying to iron out.
Well, watching, so we're recording this the day after the Europa League final, which happened at San Mamés in Bilbao. Obviously, it was Manchester United against Spurs. Not a classic, so no wonder we pine for when an era when football was actually good to watch. And yeah, we're certainly not letting that down this week as we are heading across to eastern Spain. We are going to the Valencia community once again, but this time to go to a little town just north of Valencia. Again, my geography is not always great at this, but I assume it's a little bit north of Valencia. To a little town called Villarreal. Now, did you know, Paul, that only 50,000 people live in Villarreal?
Well, if it wasn't for the fact that that's often shoehorned into pretty much every article you'll ever read on Villarreal, I wouldn't know, no.
No, I think the first sentence of every article that you ever read about Villarreal is, oh, it's home to 50,000 people and is well-renowned for the ceramics industry. So much so that the stadium is named the Stadio de la Ceramica. So, yes, we're not here to use the parchants or metaphors about Villarreal. We're here to focus on a golden era for Villarreal, but in particular, in that number 9 role, are we going to say, Paul?
Yeah, although, I mean, one of them didn't wear the number 9 that people were going to talk about tonight. But yeah, it's definitely a number 9 role. The poacher.
Yes, exactly. The fox in the box. And the angle we want to take on this is very similar to something that's been at the forefront in Spain, certainly the conversation in Spain, since the turn of the year. Everyone's looking down towards Real Betis at the moment, obviously what Manuel Pellegrini is doing. They've reached a Europa Conference League final. They're in with a shout of potentially reaching the Champions League, in the league as well, if things keep going their way. But a lot of it's been centered this second half season around Anthony. Now, Anthony, as you know, me and you know, based in the Northwest, is a bit of a joke figure. He came with a massive price tag from Ajax. He was an Erik ten Hag super signing, and he flopped at Old Trafford, didn't he? But in Spain, he's been rejuvenated, he's been rebirthed, and he's an absolute world beater now.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he is a bit of a joke to people who watch the Premier League. Certainly, people on the blue half of Manchester, they like to point out his flaws when he was playing for United, and obviously the price tag that he came with as well. But if you didn't see him play at Manchester United and you only saw him play at Real Betis this season, you would think it's a completely different Anthony that people are talking about. And he's certainly not the first player who's. I'm sorry, I'm going to ruin your hook here. He's not the first player who's had maybe a chalk and cheese sort of, or a day and night career from going from Manchester United to Spain, is he?
No, absolutely. And that's sort of the hook we want to take with this one as well, because it's not a new phenomenon that people can be at Manchester United, be really poor, and then go and thrive elsewhere. And it certainly didn't happen for the two chaps we're going to talk about tonight. So the first one that we're going to talk about, Diego Forlan at Villarreal. Signed on for a very good price. Villarreal are excellent at this. Again, we look at the transfer business they've done with Ayoze Perez this season, for example. Only €4 million for him. Back in 2004, they decided to splash the cash to sign Diego Forlan from Manchester United. Now, at the time, I don't know if you recall it, Paul. I certainly do, but he was, again, the joke figure at Old Trafford, isn't it? It was, you're bringing Forlan on, so the game must be won. type thing. And he again, similar to Anthony, he was a bit of a joke figure, wasn't he?
Yeah, I'd certainly say that. I think he's sort of labelled it. Well, they all get labelled as a flop, don't they? But when he was at Manchester United, he was very much a bit of a sideshow character, really, because bearing in mind, how good Manchester United were at the time. It's early 2000s, Alex Ferguson. I'm not going to name those players because I don't like to give them compliments, because I'm a bit of blue.
I was going to say,
but
I know how hard that must have been for you to say.
yeah, just acknowledging it. I'm only joking. I'm not that bit. Well, I am. But yeah, so he was considered somewhat clumsy, I guess, as well. Unfortunate in front of goal. He first came to United, he went 20 odd games, didn't he, before he even scored? I think it was 25, 26, maybe even more games before he got his first goal. It seemed to be like a full season, and he was, like you say, when he was bringing him on, it's kind of like, oh, the game must be wrapped up now if they're bringing him on, sort of thing. It was, but let's be honest with you, though, there was a couple of other strikers at the club that he did have to compete with at the time. Give him some credit.
And I think that's maybe where Forlan was, and maybe what he needed. He went from being, a very big fish in a small pond to then going to Manchester United at their pomp under Sir Alex Ferguson, competing with the likes of Ruud van Nistelrooy for a starting spot. And, it just didn't click for him at all. And, it sort of ended in a bit of a damp squib. And he then gets this offer from Villarreal, who at the time are starting to maybe not become a force, but they're starting to flirt a bit in La Liga, aren't they? They're starting to look upwards. They've sort of got promoted around the turn of the century, and they were building, they were getting strength. They'd just taken Juan Román Riquelme on loan, and we're just moving towards signing him. Now they're looking for a star striker, but at the time, they weren't going to be going out and spending 10 million, 15 million on a striker because they just didn't have the finances to compete. So, being shrewd, they looked at Diego Forlan as a rough article at Manchester United and clearly identified him as someone who could come in and potentially be someone who could change, what happens at Villarreal, what happens at the Estadio de la Ceramica. And he really did. And, just to, not to focus too much on the actual transfer saga of it, 3 million euros, he comes to Spain, he hits the ground running, he scores on his debut against Valencia, which if you are a Villarreal fan, you are giving him instant legendary status if you score against Valencia. And he basically just never looked back, did he, Paul?
No, and that's certainly the way you want to win over your fans, isn't it? Scoring against your rivals. He hits the ground running, and running is certainly something that I think is a good word to attribute to him, because he, for all of his struggles at United as well, like he was a hard worker. He put the effort in, and he carried that over straight away into Spain, and we saw him be quite an explosive forward at times. Usually, you mentioned Riquelme, who was key to his success there, but it's Pellegrini who's the manager at Villarreal when he comes in, and I think you could see it was almost like this. He'd been given a new lease of life under Pellegrini, or a new air of confidence at Villarreal that he'd been missing, certainly at United, and he just seemed to grow season after season, game after game. Really, you'd see Forlan walking taller and taller, and obviously, later in his career, after 3 years at Villarreal, he goes to Atletico Madrid and forms a phenomenal partnership with Kun Aguero in particular. But you can really see the progress, I'd say, game by game, during his entire time at Villarreal. The goals to games and the amount of assists as well is quite phenomenal, really.
Yeah, I think the two threads to really pull on there are especially the Pellegrini factor and the Riquelme factor. That first season when he's in Spain with Villarreal, they finish, I think it was third. I think they finished in that season, qualifying for the Champions League for the first time ever. So again, he's gone there, leaving a Champions League club to go and do something with them. He finishes on 25 goals for the season. He gets to Pichichi. He finishes joint European Golden Boot winner alongside Thierry Henry. So it's sometimes hard to really compute the transformation that he had. But a lot of that does link back to Manuel Pellegrini and the type of coach that he is. And he is renowned for picking players up, not when they're down. Well, no, actually, yeah, when they're down, and galvanizing them and making them, 10 times better than making them world beaters. We look at Isco, at Real Betis in the last couple of seasons, for example. I don't know if there was anyone at Manchester City at the time that you would say that happened for him as well. But he just seems to have that coaching method where people will run through walls for him, won't they?
Yeah. And just to, because I'll use any opportunity to do this. At City, he was nicknamed This Charming Man, which is obviously a reference to Smith's song, but it was actually born out the fact that it was a reflection of his character. He is, for the most part, he's very calm, very cool-headed, and takes a measured approach. And you can see him; he doesn't necessarily put his arm around players all the time, but he does talk to them in this kind of a fatherly way. And you could see it with, I think, to maybe pick out without individual players, you could probably look at his first season in charge of City, where they've just sacked Roberto Mancini, who was a fan favourite, and at the time fans were quite upset that Mancini had just gone. And Pellegrini acknowledges that in his first press conference. He's like, I know I've got to come here and win the fans over, and he's also got to pick up at what was a divided dressing room. Does that by just speaking in a very gentle manner and saying the right things at the right times. He's not necessarily a man of many words, but he's a man of important words, and that is something that has been the same with him throughout his career. And we do see that now at Betis. I would say that probably in the last sort of maybe 10 years, there's been moments where he's been a bit snappy at times when he's got angry. I think that's probably more of a weariness with him, because obviously he's been in the game for a long time and he's in his 70s now, isn't he? But he's still working, managing at the highest level. But certainly when he was at Villarreal and at City, and also we can't forget when he was manager of Real Madrid as well for that season. I think we should come back to. We could probably do a whole series on a whole episode or so on Pellegrini, because opportunistic. Maybe if next season turns out to be his last at Betis and he does choose to retire. But I think it's definitely worth coming back to his season at Real Madrid, because there's a lot to that. Anyway. You do see that he is somebody who recognizes what players need. Now, sometimes that is the hairdryer. Other times, it's just a case of telling players to remove themselves from the situation and take 5 minutes. He's very, very good at doing that. I mean, the rebirth of Isco in the last 18 months or so is absolutely phenomenal. But let's think about it in what the topic of this episode is. So, I mean, we're so good at going off on tangents, or I am at least. Anyway.
There's so much to talk about, but you're right. What he's done with these other players. I don't want to say it started with Forlan, because I imagine that he had this in him all the time. But this arm around Forlan, that confidence that it must have given Diego, that someone was willing to take a punt on him when he was at his lowest, and then to turn him into this absolute world beater, outside of Villarreal, when he goes to the World Cup, I think it's in 2006, and he finishes, I think, top of the goal scoring charts in Germany. So, he's a player completely transformed. And, what Pellegrini does in terms of coaching with him is fantastic, but what he does for him on the pitch as well, in embracing his strengths, which is, again, I think a very good Pellegrini factor, where, we could talk about Manuel for hours, I think. His relationship with Juan Román Riquelme, though, was almost telepathic, wasn't it? We love Riquelme anyway. and he's one of my favourite players of all time. But his connection with Diego Forlan was just another level that really took Villarreal to another level, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it felt like there was a certain aura around the club anyway at the time. Yes, they were on the up, but there was special moments in games, and it seems to be. I mean, look, we can probably say, and we probably, if we went through the team sheet, we could probably say, look, oh, that's a great player. That we're using hindsight a lot of the time when we say, oh, he was a great player, because we've got the benefit of seeing how their careers played out over time.
Yeah.
Whereas I think looking back and trying to recall, what it was like back then to witness the rise of Villarreal in this way. It felt like there was it was quite an emotive time as well. Like, as in, there just seemed to be this bit of magic around, and you could see it within the relationships within the individuals on the pitch and the coaching staff, and certainly the fans. You think about, obviously, nowadays we kind of see when, and La Liga TV are very, very good at showing you these drone shots of stadiums all lit up at night, and they do look beautiful. It's a great bit of cinematography, but like it in 2004, 5, 6, 7, you didn't necessarily have those sort of shots on your telly, but you still kind of felt like you were. I mean, we've waxed lyrical about this before when we've spoken about some of the other favorite seasons, certainly the Depor episode, where it felt like you were in there. There was an atmosphere, but Villarreal or Madrigal or La Ceramica, whichever you want to call it, at the time still felt like it had that buzz around it, and I think that resonated between players on the pitch, manager, and fans in the stands as well.
It was so different back then, watching Forlan in this side as well, and again, to hark back to something we said a few weeks ago, this is when Champions League football was on terrestrial television. You could switch on Channel 3 and you would be there, and so you got a sense of the stadium there as well. I remember watching games of Villarreal and just seeing these sort of like 4 pillars in the corners, these like brick fascias and stuff like that, and it sparks an interest. And again, you talk about the atmosphere there. Diego Forlan absolutely loved that, and he vibed on it. And he would just run through walls, wouldn't he? And his pressing game was probably way far ahead of what it is like now. If he was in a Klopp team, he'd be absolutely incredible. But just his goal scoring as well, to come in and have that confidence to hit the ground running and become, a fan favorite, a goal scorer. That hat trick at the Camp Nou as well, which I don't think anyone at Villarreal had done before. Was just, he was brilliant that way.
He was, yeah. And like you said, the goal scoring. So first season, I've got the stats here. So it's 38 appearances, 25 goals, 6 assists. Obviously, you mentioned Pichichi and joint top European scorer with Thierry Henry. Second season, 32 games. And then we've got 10 more goals, which is a bit off. But that's when they reached the semi-finals of the Champions League, which for Villarreal is, particularly at that time, Villarreal is phenomenal. And then his final season, it's 19 goals in 36 games. But there was a dynamism. I think that's probably the right word. You're right in saying he thrived off the connection with the fans. There was a buzz, and he carried that, created special moments. Obviously, after those 3 years, he moves on, but he'd lifted that club. He took that club forward, or he was certainly part of it. And I'm not saying it was single-handed, because there was like the likes of Riquelme and obviously many others as well. But there was Forlan was kind of, I don't know, it felt like he was rejuvenated there, and in turn he dragged the club to a new level.
Yeah, and I think the question, or the exam question we have for this is, what did that for him? Was Diego Forlan always a good player, but just at the wrong time for Manchester United, or is he, or the lazy answer, I suppose, would be, oh well, Spain's easier to play football than England, which is not necessarily the case at all. But is it more like a poetry with the with the languages, or with the climate and stuff like that, or is it just as simple as he had I'm not saying Manuel Pellegrini is a better manager than Sir Alex Ferguson, but he had someone who was more attuned to him in order to turn us into this world beater. Because, like you say, him reaching, the Champions League semi-finals with, I'm going to say again, this small side. We consider Villarreal to be, a bit of a a giant in Spanish football now, given their longevity. But at the time, they just come back into La Liga only 3 years beforehand, and then within 6 years, they were in a Champions League semi-final, spearheaded by Diego Forlan. You can't really quantify that, other than his contribution was a massive part of that, and his goals were a massive part of that as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's not a case like you say of mentioning whether the Pellegrini is a better manager or than the Ferguson, but that's not the sort of conversation we're getting to. But he is perhaps a manager that was better suited, or that Forlan was better suited to. And you get that in all walks of life. It's not just football. Like, I'm sure we've all had it where if you think back when you're talking to your friends about what you do for a living, you might say like, oh, my new boss is all right. My last boss was the best, but you know what I mean? And we're all like that, and that affects our output, doesn't it? And it's the same for footballers, perhaps even more so because of football being, an emotive career. And to go to the question that you raised about, is this that Forlan was a different player, or that Spain allowed him to reach a new level? I think that there was always the talent in there. I mean, and I say this for two reasons. United don't and didn't tend to sign flops. They tend to do their research on them, or they did in the Ferguson era. However, it sometimes doesn't work out, does it? I mean,
No.
Gerard Piqué is another player who didn't fit in under Ferguson, but then would go on to achieve many things, including Shakira. And
yep, in his noticeable mentions.
Yeah. You can cut that bit.
I'm clipping that bit up and sending it to him.
Oh no, don't. Yeah. So, in addition to that, we could also look at the. You mentioned the 2006 World Cup, but what about the 2010 World Cup with Uruguay, where it's Forlan and Suarez, and the handball against Ghana aside, like Uruguay were incredible that World Cup, and it was his energy. I mean, obviously there's Luis Suarez anyway, but it was a Forlan who was the foil for Suarez in that team, and he seemed to encapsulate a lot of what they were trying to achieve. And there was bits of him in that World Cup that I was like, oh, that is the guy from Villarreal, a handful of years earlier. I mean, to be fair though, he'd also been an incredible player at Atleti in between those two key events. But class is permanent, I think.
Oh yeah, I think that's definitely it. And I suppose he falls into that category of this phenomenon that Uruguay keep producing world-class strikers from such a small population as well, and he's very much at the forefront of that as well within his own defined era too. Obviously, you've already mentioned that after the Champions League final, and then the World Cup in Germany 2006, he then moves on to Atletico Madrid. Also really successful there as well. We'd be remiss not to mention how good he was there, and the partnership that he that he had with Kun Aguero. And if I remember rightly, he went in to replace Fernando Torres as well, didn't he?
Yeah. So Torres had just gone to Liverpool. The great hope, which if you're replacing a 16, 17, 18-year-old, I think he was 17, wanted Torres when he moved. But he was El Nino. He was the kid from the neighborhood that the Calderon adored. And Forlan, I mean, it's weird to say that, a player who you got 10 years old, 10 years older than, that you're going to fill his big shoes when you go there. But that's the reality of it, You're going to replace a fan favorite, and oh boy, does he do that.
Yeah, he really does. And again, sort of leaning into the foil analogy that you had with Suarez, he had that with Aguero as well. That sort of like, again, gave him the room to develop. And, he wasn't as prolific as at Atleti than he was at Villarreal, but his contributions, his energy, his running, his pressing, he was just, the complete forward at both, Villarreal and Atletico Madrid. Obviously went on to have success elsewhere back in South America too, if I remember rightly. But I'll ask you this question. Do you know what it's up to now?
I actually don't. I should have looked up before we jumped on, but I don't know what he's doing these days.
He has joined the ATP Tennis Masters Tour. He's now a tennis player, would you believe? Using that energy and that fitness and that pressure and that dynamism to go and play a completely different sport as well, which I love for Diego. I love that is his arc.
Yeah, that's really nice. That I feel all warm inside now and all that. Yeah, that's good. I like that.
Oh no,
I should have looked that up, but no, yeah, that's a nice end, isn't it?
It's definitely been one of those lovely little TikToks that I've seen where I say, where are people now? And, I've spent the better part of the early part of this week looking at videos of Diego Forlan, and he's actually quite good at tennis, to be fair. I think he won one of his tournaments that he was in. And, if you're going to, saunter off into retirement and enjoy yourself, you might as well play a sport that you're really, really good at as well as football. So why not? Obviously, his time at Villarreal came to an end. Very successful period for the club. Again, we're talking Champions League. We're talking about best finishes in the league. Again, Villarreal obviously get this money for him, but they're not a club that can go and absolutely, splash the cash. They've got, remits which they've got to stay with inside. So again, they look towards Old Trafford for a replacement, and they come across a young American-Italian forward. I want to say he's definitely from America, because I'm pretty sure he's from New Jersey, but he played for Italy. From Manchester United, Giuseppe Rossi. Now, again, I don't think this was the same level as Forlan, but Giuseppe Rossi was always seen as a bit of a prospect, but never a permanent feature for United, wasn't he? He was kind of like the first ever, we'll buy him to sell him kind of striker, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah, his opportunities were limited, United, but in a slightly different sense to Forlan, where Forlan had a bit more of an unfortunate time. I think Rossi was just sort of didn't quite get the chance because he was, like you say, a prospect, and he had the potential but didn't get the opportunity to really deliver it at United. And sometimes we do see it where it's to the benefit of both parties if the player moves on, and I think that's fair to say about Giuseppe Rossi.
Yeah. Well, he was competing with Wayne Rooney at Manchester United as well. We're becoming beginning of prime Wayne Rooney at this point. I'm fairly certain that they've just signed Cristiano Ronaldo at this point, as well as another prospect. Maybe the season before or the season of. So again, he's coming through as a bit of a force as well. So chances are limited. So again, Villarreal do the exact same thing they did with Diego Forlan and go, well, Sir Alex, if you don't fancy this boy, we'll take him. We know you've done your homework. Let's try this again. And it happens again. 2007, they sign a player from Manchester United. He scores his first goal against Valencia, and he goes on to have an absolutely brilliant season with the club. And, he wasn't as prolific as Forlan in his first season, but over time, I think this is maybe the difference between Rossi and Forlan, is that over time Rossi became a bit of a legend at the Estadio de la Ceramica, didn't he? He was quickly the face of the team, so to speak.
Yeah, and Rossi, I think as well, he becomes, for better or worse, he becomes a bit of a cult hero at Villarreal as well because of the injuries he's got to endure, on top of the fact that he's clearly a phenomenal talent, a great natural talent. I think he's probably, he's a different type of player to Forlan, but I think he was also the sort of player who at the time had a different appeal to the fan base because he's got his wicked left foot, but he also had a bit of flair about him as well. That
I'm
not saying that Forlan didn't have flair. Forlan had a bit more tenacity, I'd say, but
Yeah.
Rossi was slightly more. It's going to sound condescending, but a bit more stylish, a bit more swagger, but without me, there was a little bit of an edge
Yeah.
to Rossi with the ball at his feet that you didn't know. I mean, obviously you knew that it was going to end with him trying to cut in and shoot with his stronger foot, but like there was still, a bit of a drop of the shoulder or something about him. He could create things in a different way to Forlan, I'd say.
The parallel that I had in my head for Rossi is not a young Michael Owen, but a confident Michael Owen, if that makes sense, who really liked to have his shot from distance, but he was really good with the ball at his feet. He was nimble. He kept the ball close. He could take a player on in close quarters. He's like you say, he had that different angle to Forlan in terms of he wasn't, pressing the ball all the time. He wasn't doing loads of running around, but what he did was actually quite clever with the ball, was probably the way to describe it. But again, you look at this player arriving, in Villarreal and then going, right, well, I'm here to establish myself now. I've got to fill the shoes of a player who's obviously done really, really well. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And across the course of his seasons with them, I think his best season was in 2010, 2011, where he returned 32 goals across all competitions, which, are the numbers that are the likes of, Ronaldo were hitting and as we had Henry at Barcelona and things like that. These were high figures for a player who was actually quite, I don't want to say underrated, but he wasn't spoken about in the same conversations as that nucleus of players, was he?
No, he wasn't. And I think as well, it's not helped by the fact that maybe if I mean, to be fair, he's still making 20 plus, even 30 plus appearances in his first few years at Villarreal, but it still felt like his career was a bit stop start. I mean, the poor guy he had several ACL injuries, didn't he? Particularly,
Yeah.
I mean, I remember first season that City got into the Champions League, we were drawn against Villarreal, and it was all watch out for, at the time, Villarreal had Nilmar, Marcos Senna, Giuseppe Rossi, and there was another player as well that, like, you knew the name of him and instantly thought, I hope he's not playing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, during that season, I didn't get the opportunity to see Rossi play in the flesh because he was out for 9 months or so, ACL. So he missed pretty much. I don't think he makes it into double figures for appearances that season for the club. I'm pretty certain it's entire season's wiped out. And I might be right in thinking as well that does he miss all of the next campaign as well? Does he come back at pre-season and then he misses the second campaign because they're in Segunda at that point?
Yeah.
So he's the poor guy. He can't quite catch a break in that sense. And if he could have done and had a proper run together, I think we would be talking about him in a different bracket to what he's remembered. But I remember thinking of him as being, quite exciting and capable. He was another one though, slightly different to Forlan. He could bring other players into play.
Yeah.
I don't know. Would it be fair to say he was probably more technical than Forlan in how he moved the ball? You definitely used the word clever, and I think that's fair as well. Like I think his link-up play was very, very good, and it brought others in the team into the game very well. So yeah, maybe had he had a bit more luck on the injury front, we might have been talking about him in a slightly different bracket.
Oh, absolutely. I think the injuries, really did rob both him and Villarreal of some really momentous moments. Some really class or potentially club defining elements. But he's still so fondly remembered. And there's always this story of that. Rossi could find the bottom corner with his left foot from anywhere, and again he was just that brilliant on his day. But he's so hampered by injuries that he just couldn't seem to get that run of things together. I was looking at one of his goals he scored in the Europa League in I think it was 2012, where he just he doesn't even hit it hard with his left foot. He kind of like just lofts it into the top corner, like a bit of a sand wedge or a pitching wedge or something. But it's just a technique that done that. And I think the thing that I think about Giuseppe Rossi as well as a striker, as much as he's American born, he's quintessentially an Italian style striker of that era. We're talking, Rossi, Cassano, we're talking Di Natale.
Yeah.
They were all in the same mold, weren't they? Where they could hit a ball from anywhere, but their hold-up play and their link-up play was so clever that they added a different dimension to any team that they were in.
Yeah, absolutely. Just those names there. It's we obviously we're not an Italian football podcast, are we? But some of those names there are just they were magical players, weren't they? And to be, for him to be a part of that team at the time, it's not a bad set of colleagues to have, is it really? And he fit in perfectly with them, which is a credit to him in itself. Would it be fair to say that when maybe subconsciously when you compared him to Michael Owen, that the injuries and the way that they hampered his career might have something to do with it? Because I feel like Owen was another player who on his day was, well, obviously he was world class, but he was one who I think really struggled. I mean, he's a dreadful commentator. I can't stand it having to listen to him as a pundit. But what a player he was,
I think it's just that low profile nature of them. We maybe not to go off on another tangent again, but at the time we were so used to seeing strikers who were 5'11", 6 foot tall, and you lump it to the big man up top. And again, I think Owen broke the mold ever so slightly on that. Maybe Ian Wright as well, maybe to give a bit of an earlier credit to that. But I think Rossi was very much in the same. But he also wasn't shy for putting his head on the ball either. Let's not forget, as much as we talk about him hitting these wonder goals from distance, he was always in the right place at the right time to get a glancing header at the front post, for example. By the time that he'd left Villarreal, he was the club's all-time leading goal scorer at the time. 82 goals in 192 appearances isn't anything to shake a stick at, is it really? It's almost 1 in 2. I think it's, in quick maths, maybe 1.25 goals a game.
Yeah.
So not 1.25 goals again. That's terrible maths. 1.25 goals every 2 games is probably what I'm trying to say. But, if he didn't get injured so often, he didn't have these ACLs, he could quite easily still be the top goal scorer for Villarreal ever. And his impact was completely undeniable at the club.
Yeah. And it's to go back to, we're talking of an era where it's like, I suppose if Forlan and the semi-finals of the Champions League was like the first sort of real golden era for Villarreal, well, just handful of years, 5 years later, Villarreal are back in the Champions League, but then they also have that really strong Europa League run. They get to the semi-finals of that as well with Rossi as part of the team. And all right, in the last 5 years, was it 2019? 2020? They have since won the Europa League, but to think about it and put it in perspective of at the time, this was a young sort of team of dynamic players who. But it'd be fair to say we're punching above the weight, really, as a club, weren't they? Villarreal, even, I mean, they still do it now to an extent. Some people argue, but this was really, this was something else. This and there was charisma with it, and I think Rossi was one of them who brought the charisma with him.
And I think he epitomised that as well, because I think he was linked with a couple of moves away from Villarreal, especially during the early years that he was there, because his goal scoring form was being noticed, and he decided to stay because I think again they've taken a chance on me. I'm in a really happy place, and Villarreal fans are really, really special. So it was always interesting to see that loyalty that he had to Villarreal, and I think afterwards he went to Genoa. So again, having that crack in Italy as well for him was always a bucket list moment for him. Being American born, lived in England, now lived in Spain, and going actually plying his trade in again one of the the all-time greatest clubs in Italy for me, in Genoa. And played in a similar stadium as well. Let's not forget those sort of like,
Yeah.
brick cornered stadium, so to speak. But for me with Forlan and Rossi, over the course of almost a decade, they really defined what it was to be watching Villarreal. They really encapsulated the funness of it, the atmosphere, the yellow kits. It was everything about that period in time for Villarreal, which I think we still appreciate now. But they seem a bit more nowadays. Not organised isn't the word, but it seems a bit more expected that Villarreal will be doing things. Back then, everything was a surprise for me.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And the mention there that you've got about how nowadays maybe it is expected, I think that's true as well. And we've become accustomed to Villarreal being, a top 5-6 team on average over the last few years, or we expect them to be in and around the European spots one way or another. And that is born purely out of the fact that for between 2002, 2003 to 2010, 11, they were punching considerably above their weight with a team of likable players who, I mean, let's not forget there were a young Santi Cazorla was there as well before he joined Malaga. So if you're talking about little geniuses, but he's, this is what players like Rossi and Forlan have done is they've changed people's perception of Villarreal, and with that they've changed people's expectations of Villarreal. Whereas, to go back to what we started this episode about, you mentioned it, that a town of 50,000. Well, I remember, and this is one of those, when we do these comparisons that we've had over the years, I think, over the last few episodes, where you compared one of the most beautiful stadiums in Spain to Preston bus station. Well, I have read articles by well-paid journalists actually comparing Villarreal to Burnley. So, apologies to both tourist boards there. But
Sure, Burnley won't mind that.
no. Yeah, let's move on quickly.
No. And I think one of the fundamental elements of how Villarreal do things hasn't changed from the time when they did get promoted to La Liga to now. As we mentioned at the top of the show, Ayoze Perez coming in from Real Betis, people probably thought strange move. His contributions this season are going to help, or pretty much have guaranteed Villarreal Champions League football for next season. So they're a team that don't need to change the wheel, so to speak. They just keep doing what they're doing, and they'll find success by picking up these gems. And Forlan and Rossi, for me, were two of the best buys in Spanish football ever, really. There's probably not a lot of other people we can compare it to.
There's a case for that. And actually, just because you mentioned him, and it's got me thinking, Ayoze Perez is probably the one player that comes to mind who has broken the sort of trend that we spoke about earlier. So you had Forlan joins the club under Pellegrini, gets a new air of confidence and plays brilliantly. Rossi joins the club under Pellegrini, gets a new air of confidence, plays brilliantly. Anthony at Betis joins the club under Pellegrini. But Ayoze Perez leaves Pellegrini's Betis to go to Villarreal, and he's probably player of the season outside one of the top two clubs for the season that's just gone. Some people are saying he's the signing of the 2024-2025 campaign. I think he's the only one who books the trend there. But as you say, it's Villarreal, and historically they do make some very shrewd moves, and it makes you or it certainly makes me believe that they will continue to be a club whose aspirations are larger than what the club should realistically be aiming for, really, from a town of that size and everything like that. And yes, okay, and I know we should acknowledge this, because you will, for every article you see romanticizing Villarreal. If you look in the comments, you'll see fans from other clubs in Spain who, to be fair, I think it is a decreasing minority, but they are quite vocal of people who think that it's unfair how, in their eyes, Villarreal have been bankrolled by the ownership, which I'm not going to get into because I think that's kind of what modern football is now anyway. And there are much larger clubs who are being pumped full of money from elsewhere. We won't get into that, but I still think that what Villarreal have achieved is something very special, and I think there'll be a club who, because they've got the right setup in my eyes in terms of their recruitment policy, and I think that they're very sustainable. I think they'll be around for a long time, continuing to punch above their supposed weight.
Yeah, no, I can definitely agree and testify to that one as well, and long may it continue as well, because they are a great team to watch, and they've always got exciting players either signed or coming through their cantera. So Villarreal is very much high on my list of places to go visit as well. The improvements to the Estadio de la Ceramica in the last few years. Apparently, it's very yellow when you actually get inside it as well, which apparently doesn't help if you sat in the away end. Matt told me that when he went to watch Malaga against Villarreal Bay a couple of years ago. But still, fun all the same, and also very fun to talk to you about Diego Forlan and Guiseppe Rossi tonight, because again, two players that probably don't get mentioned in a lot of conversations when we talk about the Spain of old time now, as we would call it, but two players that certainly made an impact and were absolutely incredible to watch in their prime, playing in that beautiful yellow kit as well, Villarreal. It was brilliant to watch.
Perfect. Yeah, it was. Well, yeah, sorry. I didn't know if that was a question, but yeah, it was beautiful to watch. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably a good place to end it. It was beautiful to watch. We'll just keep repeating it's beautiful to watch. But yeah, Forlan and Rossi, two strikers, two eras, one massive club transformed. One brought firepower and ambition, one brought finesse, one brought talent and ability to stick it in the bottom left-hand corner from wherever he was stood on the pitch. It was brilliant to see them do that. So this has been El Partido. I want to thank you, Paul, for joining me this evening. Obviously, I know we've both been a little bit under the weather this week, but we've still managed to get this podcast out, which is the main thing.
Yeah, we've soldiered on. Like Giuseppe Rossi overcoming injuries, we've overcome common colds and various other bugs that we've picked up over the week, and we've persevered, and it's been enjoyable as ever.
Yes, I will apologise as well if anyone has heard me sneeze or cough throughout this, because I've been fine up until we click record, and then all of a sudden the onset came. So I do apologise for that. But we'll be back again next week, where we've got a really, really cool, exciting interview planned. So let's hope that comes off there to talk about one of the quintessential best clubs in Spain, and also potentially a book that's been written about it. No spoilers there. But for now, we'll see you later, and we'll catch you next time. Hasta luego.